In the dense, fog-choked forests of the Hürtgenwald, a battered platoon of American soldiers was about to walk into a slaughter. A routine push to secure a ridgeline turned into a death trap when entrenched German forces unleashed a withering ambush. Lieutenant Daniel Keating wasn't your typical schoolteacher-turned-officer. For 2 years he had led men through the blood-soaked battlefields of Europe, known for keeping his platoon alive against impossible odds. When German MG-42s ripped through his dwindling unit, the enemy had no idea they were facing a man who had learned to fight dirty. Keating refused to die for nothing. He countered with a daring near-suicidal maneuver that would turn the hunters into the hunted. What began as a doomed advance would become a desperate last stand. The Hürtgenwald would never be the same after Lieutenant Keating led a handful of survivors in a do-or-die charge against an enemy stronghold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Daniel Keating tasted copper as he bit the inside of his cheek, studying the crumpled map in his trembling hands. Not from fear, though fear was there, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that had settled into his body over the past 72 hours of continuous combat. The paper was stained with mud, sweat, and something darker he chose not to dwell on. "Push forward to these coordinates," Captain Harris had said, jabbing a finger at the map. "Intel says the ridge is lightly defended. Take your platoon and secure it while we regroup. Should be a cakewalk, Lieutenant." A cakewalk. Keating had seen the captain's eyes shift away when he'd said it, felt the weight behind the words that remained unspoken. "Intelligence is wrong. We're sending you to die so the rest of us can live." He folded the map carefully, tucking it into his breast pocket as he surveyed what remained of his once 30-strong platoon. 19 men. 19 men with hollow eyes and dirt-crusted faces who trusted him to make the right call, who believed, or needed to believe, that he could get them home. Before the war, he'd been a schoolteacher, had taught history to boys barely younger than Private Monroe, the fresh-faced replacement who even now was checking and rechecking his rifle with shaking hands. Monroe had been with them for 3 days, still held onto the notion that war was something that happened in textbooks and propaganda reels. "Sir?" Sergeant Mason appeared at his side, his face a mask of controlled fury. "We're ready to move out." Mason, reaper to the men, had been a farm boy from Nebraska. Nothing remained of that life in him now. Where Keating still occasionally wrestled with his conscience, Mason had long ago decided that morality was a luxury they couldn't afford. "They're sending us to die, aren't they?" Mason said quietly, his voice pitched low so only Keating could hear. Keating met his NCO's gaze steadily. "Probably, but we've got our orders." "Orders?" Mason spat the word like a curse. "Those boys up at command have no fucking idea what's happening on the ground. They're moving pins on a map while we're bleeding out in the mud." "I know, Will." It was the first time Keating had used Mason's given name in months. "But we go anyway." Mason's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "We always do." Keating turned to address his men. No rousing speech came to mind. Those were for officers who hadn't seen what war really was. "Check your ammo. Stay tight. Watch your sectors. We move in 5. The Hürtgenwald pressed in around them, ancient trees rising like silent sentinels. Mist clung to the forest floor, obscuring roots and fallen branches that seemed determined to trip them with every step. The smell of wet earth mingled with the lingering scent of cordite from the morning's artillery barrage. Corporal Sam Kowalski, the platoon's sharpshooter, moved up to walk alongside Keating. Polish immigrant's son with a gift for finding his target through impossible foliage. "Something ain't right, LT," he muttered. "Forest is too quiet." Keating had noticed it too. No birdsong, no distant rumble of vehicles or artillery, just the sound of their own labored breathing and the soft crunch of leaves beneath their boots. "Stay sharp," he replied, scanning the ridgeline ahead. The objective lay just beyond, a German stronghold supposedly manned by a skeleton crew. But the prickling at the back of his neck told him otherwise. They had covered half the distance to the ridge when Private Monroe stumbled, his foot catching on an exposed root. The sound of his gear rattling seemed catastrophically loud in the stillness. And then the forest erupted. The distinctive rattle of MG-42s, Hitler's buzzsaw, tore through the silence. Muzzle flashes lit up previously invisible pillboxes nestled among the trees. The Germans had been waiting for them. "Contact front, get down!" Keating's voice competed with the deafening chatter of machine gun fire. Men dropped to the earth or dove behind trees as bullets cut through the air where they had stood moments before. A scream to his left. Private. Jessup taking a burst across his chest, dead before he hit the ground. Another cry from behind as a bullet found Rodriguez. "Suppressing fire!" Mason roared, his bar already hammering out rounds toward the nearest pillbox. Keating's training took over. First squad, left flank. Second squad, covering fire. Third squad with me. But the carefully practiced maneuvers dissolved into chaos as more German guns opened up from concealed positions. They weren't facing a skeleton crew. This was a heavily fortified position with interlocking fields of fire. "Fall back," Keating shouted, gesturing frantically. "Into the trees. Fall back and regroup." Scattered and panicked, the platoon broke into smaller groups, retreating into the deeper forest as bullets tore chunks of bark from trees and kicked up dirt around their fleeing forms. Keating grabbed Monroe by his webbing, practically dragging the frozen replacement to safety. 20 minutes later, what remained of the platoon had gathered behind a massive fallen oak 200 yards back from the ambush site. The head count was grim. 12 men left from the 19 who had started. 7 good men gone in less than a minute of contact. Private Eddie Walsh, Doc to the men, was working frantically on Peterson, who had taken a round through his lower abdomen. The medic's gentle hands were slick with blood as he tried to stem the bleeding. "Lieutenant?" Doc's soft voice carried a weight that silenced the hushed conversations around them. "I need to make a choice. Peterson needs morphine and plasma, but so does Fitzgerald." He gestured to another wounded man lying a few feet away. "I don't have enough for both." The unspoken question hung in the air. Who lives? Who dies? Keating moved closer, examining both men. Peterson was conscious, his eyes pleading. Fitzgerald was unconscious, his breathing shallow. "Peterson has a better chance," Keating said quietly. "Save him." Doc nodded, the burden of the choice now shared between them. He returned to his work, not looking at Fitzgerald again. Mason crawled over, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Radio's shot to hell. Can't raise command. Even if we could, I doubt they'd send anyone after us." "We've been set up," Kowalski hissed, still clutching his rifle. "They knew those pillboxes were there. They fucking knew." Monroe sat with his back against the fallen tree, his face ashen, his hands still trembling. We just left them," he whispered. "Jessup, Rodriguez, we just left them." "They were already dead, kid," Mason said flatly. "Being sentimental gets you killed out here." Keating took stock of their situation. 12 men, 2 seriously wounded, limited ammunition, no radio contact, enemy forces of unknown strength between them and their lines. "So what's the play, LT?" Mason asked. "Try to circle back to our lines?" Keating considered it. The safest option would be to retreat, to try to find their way back to friendly territory. But the memory of Captain Harris's eyes sliding away from his haunted him. "We're sending you to die so the rest of us can live." What was happening back at HQ? Why was this ridge so important that they'd sacrifice an entire platoon as a diversion? "We push forward," Keating said finally. Mason stared at him. "Sir?" "We push forward," Keating repeated, his voice stronger. "Command wanted that stronghold, taken for a reason. If we go back now, those 7 men died for nothing. And if we go forward, the rest of us die too," Mason countered. Keating locked eyes with his sergeant. "We're not going to charge in blind like they wanted us to. We're going to do this our way, scout the position, find their weaknesses, strike where they don't expect us." "That's suicide," Mason said, but there was a grudging respect in his voice. "So is sitting here waiting to be found," Keating replied. "At least this way we choose how we die." He looked around at the men. Mason's barely contained rage, Kowalski's grim determination, Doc's quiet resignation, Monroe's naked fear. They were all that stood between survival and oblivion. "Rest up, conserve ammunition. We move at nightfall," Keating ordered. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." As the men settled in, Keating pulled out his map again, studying the terrain ahead. The schoolteacher in him, the man who had once believed in reason and order, knew this was madness. But the lieutenant, the man who had watched too many young men die under his command, recognized that sometimes survival meant embracing the impossible. They couldn't go back. They could only push forward into the fire and hope that somehow, against all odds, they'd emerge on the other side. Darkness settled over the Hürtgenwald like a burial shroud, bringing with it a bone-chilling mist that crept between the trees and settled in low pockets across the forest floor. The temperature had dropped sharply, and Keating could see his breath hanging in the air as he motioned for his men to halt. They had been moving for over an hour, each step measured and deliberate, guided only by Keating's compass and Kowalski's uncanny sense of direction. The wounded, Peterson and Fitzgerald, had been left behind in a shallow depression, concealed beneath a hasty covering of branches and fallen leaves. Doc Walsh had stayed with them, armed with Fitzgerald's rifle and the last of their medical supplies. "Save it for when we get back," Keating had told him when Walsh tried to refuse the weapon. The look in Walsh's eyes had said everything. "If you get back." Now, crouched in the underbrush less than half a mile from the German stronghold, Keating counted heads. 9 combat-effective men, including himself. Hardly a force to be reckoned with, especially against a fortified position. Mason silently appeared at his side, materializing from the shadows like a wraith. "German patrol, 100 yards east," he whispered. "Moving this way." Keating signaled the others to take cover. The men melted into the darkness, their mud-caked uniforms blending with the forest floor. Only Monroe seemed to struggle, his movements jerky and uncertain as he sought concealment behind a fallen log. The German patrol, 5 men moving in, a loose formation, emerged from the mist. They were clearly veterans, their rifles held ready, their eyes scanning the forest with the practiced wariness of men who'd survived this long by assuming death lurked behind every tree. Their whispered conversation carried in the still night air, something about cigarettes and rations. As they drew closer, Monroe's breathing became audible, short, panicked gasps that seemed deafening in the silence. "Control yourself, kid," Keating silently willed him. 10 more seconds and they'll pass us by. But the universe had other plans. A pine marten, startled by the tension or perhaps just bad timing, darted from a nearby hollow directly across Monroe's position. The young private flinched violently, dislodging a small cascade of pebbles that clattered down the embankment. The German patrol froze. The lead soldier raised his hand, head cocked to one side, listening. Keating's hand tightened on his sidearm. If the Germans investigated, they'd find Monroe in seconds. Then the rest of them. They couldn't afford a firefight, not here, not now. Mason caught his eye across the clearing, his hand already reaching for his combat knife. The message was clear. We take them silently, or we don't make it to morning. The German patrol leader took a step toward Monroe's position, and then salvation came from an unexpected quarter. An owl hooted from somewhere deeper in the forest. The German soldier hesitated, then laughed softly, making a comment to his comrades. They resumed their patrol, passing within feet of the hidden Americans before continuing into the night. When the sound of their footsteps had faded, Keating released the breath he'd been holding. Around him, his men did the same. Monroe was shaking visibly when Keating reached him. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't stow it," Keating said, not unkindly. "You're still breathing, they're still walking, that's a win." He gripped the young man's shoulder firmly. "But get it together, Monroe. Next time we might not be so lucky." They proceeded with even greater caution, finally reaching a vantage point overlooking the German stronghold. What they saw confirmed Keating's suspicions. This was no ordinary defensive position. The stronghold was a 3-story stone building, surrounded by hastily constructed defensive fortifications, Sandbags, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. A former hunting lodge, perhaps, repurposed for war. More importantly, it was bustling with activity. Trucks were arriving, illuminated briefly by carefully shielded lights before disappearing into a covered loading area. "That's a supply depot," Mason whispered, peering through borrowed binoculars. "Major one, by the looks of it." Kowalski nodded in agreement. "Fourth truck in the last hour. They're moving something big." Keating's mind raced. This wasn't just some random strongpoint that command wanted taken as a diversion. This was a significant logistical hub, one that could be supporting an entire sector of the German line. No wonder they'd sent his platoon on a suicide mission. Taking this position would be worth the sacrifice in command's calculating eyes. "How many men you figure?" he asked Mason. "At least 30, maybe 40, Mason replied grimly. "Heavy machine guns, probably mortars. We don't have the firepower to take that head on." Back at their temporary camp, Keating laid out what they'd seen for the rest of the men. The gravity of their situation settled over them like the mist, cold and inescapable. "So what now, Lieutenant?" Kowalski asked, cleaning his rifle with practiced movements. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from our lines." "We take the objective," Keating answered simply. Mason snorted. "With what? 9 men and whatever ammo we've got left in our pouches?" "We don't have a choice, Will," Keating replied, using Mason's first name again, a tactical choice to emphasize the gravity of the moment. "That depot is supplying God knows what to the German front. Every day it operates is another day this war drags on. Another day more of our boys die." "So we die instead?" Mason challenged, though there was less heat in his voice than before. "Look, I get it, you feel responsible for these men, so do I, but there's courage and then there's suicide." Keating met his gaze steadily. "We're dead either way. Either we die trying to accomplish something meaningful or we die trying to run. At least this way our deaths might mean something." A heavy silence fell over the group. "I'm with the LT," Kowalski said finally. "If I'm going to die in this hellhole of a forest, I want to take as many Krauts with me as I can." One by one, the others nodded their agreement, even Monroe, though his face was still pale with fear. "All right then," Mason sighed. "How do we do this? Because a frontal assault is still suicide, meaningful or not." "We don't hit them head on," Keating replied, kneeling down and sketching a rough diagram in the dirt with a stick. "We hit their supply line first." His plan was audacious, born of desperation but not without merit. They would ambush the next supply convoy, steal whatever weapons and ammunition they could, and use those resources to strike at the stronghold itself. "We're not looking to hold the position," Keating explained. "Just disrupt their operations, destroy their supplies, and get whatever intelligence we can back to our lines." "It could work," Mason admitted reluctantly, "if everything goes perfectly, but we're going to need more firepower than what we've got now." Keating nodded. "That's why we're going back to the ambush site first." The grim task of stripping ammunition and weapons from their fallen comrades was one that none of them relished, but necessity overrode sentiment. In the dead of night, they retraced their steps, moving like ghosts through the forest until they reached the blood-soaked ground where 7 of their brothers had fallen. The Germans had already collected their own dead, but had left the American bodies where they lay. Whether this was due to lack of time or simple indifference, it was impossible to say. Keating knelt beside Rodriguez's body, gently closing the young man's eyes before removing his ammunition belt. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he knew Rodriguez couldn't hear him. "We'll make it count." The others did the same, moving from body to body with solemn efficiency. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft metallic clicks of ammunition being transferred and the occasional catch of breath as someone recognized a friend among the dead. Monroe struggled the most, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped an ammunition clip, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. "I can't do this," he whispered, his young face twisted with anguish. "These are our guys." "They were our guys," Mason corrected him, his voice gentle but firm. "Now they're just bodies. What we're taking, they don't need anymore. But we do." When they had gathered all they could carry, Keating led them back to their temporary camp. The mood was somber, each man wrestling with his own thoughts. Doc Walsh met them with barely concealed anxiety. "Any sign of pursuit?" he asked. "Nothing yet," Keating replied. "But it's only a matter of time. How are they?" He nodded toward Peterson and Fitzgerald. Walsh's expression said everything. Peterson's hanging on barely. Fitzgerald. He shook his head slightly. "I did what I could, but without proper supplies." Keating placed a hand on the medic's shoulder. "You did your best, Doc. That's all any of us can do." Walsh didn't look convinced. "My best isn't good enough out here. I'm trained to save lives, but all I'm doing is watching men die slower." "Then help us make sure their deaths mean something," Keating said quietly. "We're going to hit that stronghold, and we're going to need every man." He outlined the plan again, this time with more detail. Monroe, to his surprise, would play a crucial role. "You're the fastest runner we've got," Keating explained to the young private. "And you're small enough to move without being spotted. You'll be our eyes tracking the convoy movements." Monroe swallowed hard but nodded. "I won't let you down, sir." "I know you won't," Keating replied with more confidence than he felt. As the men prepared their gear, Mason pulled Keating aside. "You're gambling a lot on that kid," he said in a low voice. "He nearly got us all killed tonight." "He's scared, not incompetent," Keating countered. "Give him a purpose, something to focus on besides his fear, and he'll come through." Mason looked skeptical but didn't argue further. "Your call, LT, just know I'll be watching his back, and yours." The night wore on, the darkness seeming to deepen rather than recede. Mist swirled through the trees, occasionally parting to reveal a star-studded sky that seemed obscenely beautiful, given the circumstances. Keating found himself thinking of his classroom back home, of the eager faces of his students as he taught them about ancient battles and historical figures. How simple it had all seemed then. Good versus evil, right versus wrong. How naive he had been. Here in the Hürtgenwald, there were no heroes, only survivors. And even that status was temporary, at best. Shortly before dawn, Kowalski returned from his reconnaissance with valuable information. The supply trucks followed a regular schedule, with the next one due in approximately 3 hours. They would have one chance to get this right. Keating gathered his men for a final briefing. 9 haggard, exhausted soldiers who should, by all rights, already be dead or captured. Yet here they stood, ready to throw themselves against the Nazi war machine with nothing but stolen ammunition and desperate courage. "I won't lie to you," Keating said, looking each man in the eye. "The odds are against us. Some of us, maybe all of us, aren't coming back from this. But what we're doing matters." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "When I was a teacher, I used to tell my students that history is made by ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. That's us, right now. Whatever happens today, make it count." No rousing cheer followed his speech, no dramatic salutes or declarations of victory, just quiet nods of acknowledgement from men who understood exactly what was at stake. As they moved out, taking up their positions for the ambush, Keating felt a strange calm settle over him. The constant fear and doubt that had plagued him since receiving his orders had receded, replaced by a crystalline clarity of purpose. They would probably die here, in this mist-shrouded forest far from home. But they would die fighting, die trying to make a difference. In a war that had long since ceased to make sense to any of them, that small certainty was all they had left. Concealed behind a fallen tree, Keating checked his watch and then his weapon. Mason crouched nearby, his eyes never ceasing their vigilant scan of the forest road. Kowalski had climbed a tree 50 yards back, his rifle trained on the approach. The others were spread out in a loose semicircle, ready to close the trap. And in the pre-dawn darkness, they waited for the convoy that would either provide them the means to complete their mission or become their funeral pyre. The German truck rounded the bend in the forest road, its headlights cutting weakly through the pre-dawn mist. The canvas-covered vehicle lumbered along, accompanied by the low growl of its engine and the crunch of tires on the gravel surface. 2 soldiers sat in the cab, the driver yawning while his companion smoked a cigarette. Behind a fallen oak 20 yards from the road, Lieutenant Keating raised his hand, waiting for exactly the right moment. Scattered among the trees, 9 American soldiers held their breath, fingers on triggers. The truck passed the first marker, a broken branch Keating had placed earlier. He dropped his hand. The forest erupted with gunfire. Kowalski's first shot took the passenger through the temple. The driver had just enough time to register shock before 3 more rounds punched through the windshield. The truck veered sharply, wheels spinning before crashing into a tree. The impact sent a dull boom echoing through the forest, followed by the hiss of escaping steam from the damaged radiator. "Move!" Keating ordered, already sprinting forward. The Americans converged on the vehicle. Mason reached it first, confirming both Germans were dead. Keating circled to the back, cutting the canvas ties with his combat knife. "Jackpot," he breathed. The truck was loaded with ammunition, grenades, and rations. Most importantly, nestled. In the corner was a Panzerschreck, the German answer to the American bazooka. "Get everything you can carry," Keating ordered. 3 minutes tops before someone comes looking. The men worked with grim efficiency, distributing ammunition and grenades, pulling the Panzerschreck and its rockets from the crate. Lowell, their demolitions man, quickly rigged what remained with the few explosives they had scavenged. Monroe stood frozen beside the cab, staring at the dead Germans, their blood pooling on the seats. "I've never seen someone die up close before," he whispered. Mason gripped his shoulder hard. "Focus, kid. Grab those rations and move. You can puke when we're clear." They were nearly finished when Kowalski's whistle cut through the air, the signal for approaching enemy. "Patrol coming," Kowalski hissed as he slid down from his perch. 6 men, moving fast. Keating made a rapid decision. "Mason, take point. Everyone else fall back to position 2. Double time." He turned to Lowell. "How long on that charge?" 30 seconds. "Make it 15. We need the distraction now." As they melted back into the forest, Lowell called softly, "Fire in the hole." The explosion tore through the morning stillness, a bright flash followed by secondary detonations as the ammunition cooked off. The truck disappeared in a ball of flame, replaced by a column of thick black smoke that rose above the tree line. "That's going to bring every Kraut for miles," Mason muttered as they ran. "That's the idea," Keating replied. "They'll focus on the explosion while we circle around to the depot." But Keating's plan began to unravel almost immediately. German shouts echoed through the trees behind them, not just from the direction of the road, but from the west as well. They were being flanked. "They're faster than we expected," Kowalski said, pausing to listen. "And there's a lot of them." Keating made a quick calculation. "Change of plan. We split up. Mason, take Miller and Lowell west. Kowalski, you're with me and Monroe east. Rendezvous at the fallen lightning tree in 2 hours." Mason hesitated. "Split our firepower?" "Split their pursuit," Keating countered. "Trust me on this." A reluctant nod, and then Mason was gone, Miller and Lowell falling in behind him. For 20 minutes, Keating's group pushed through the forest, alternating between rapid movement and frozen stillness, whenever German voices grew close. The enemy was hunting methodically, sweeping the area in an organized grid pattern. Crouched, behind a moss-covered boulder, Keating plotted their next move. The Germans were driving them eastward, away from the supply depot, away from their objective. He was being forced to react rather than act, and that was a losing game. "We need to circle back," he whispered to Kowalski. "Get behind their search line." The sharpshooter frowned. "Risky. They've got numbers and terrain knowledge. We've got no choice. Otherwise, we're just running until they catch us." They began a cautious arc, trying to loop around the German search parties. But the forest seemed alive with enemy soldiers, their voices calling to each other as they closed the net. At a small clearing, they paused to reorient. Monroe was breathing hard, his face slick with sweat despite the morning chill. "They're being coordinated," Keating realized suddenly. "Someone's directing this hunt from a central position." A new voice cut through the forest, sharper, more authoritative, issuing commands that sent the search parties shifting their patterns. "Officer," Kowalski muttered. "Sounds like he knows what he's doing, too." The distinctive crack of a rifle silenced him. A bullet whined past Keating's ear and thudded into the tree behind him. Keating dropped flat as Kowalski returned fire. 3 rapid shots toward a stand of pines 50 yards away. "Sniper!" Kowalski hissed, rolling into cover. "Top of the rise, behind the split trunk." "Can you take him?" Keating asked. The sharpshooter squinted, calculating angles. "Maybe, if he shows himself again." Monroe was huddled against a tree, his rifle clutched to his chest, hyperventilating. "Monroe," Keating said sharply, "I need you steady. Watch our 6. The private nodded jerkily, forcing himself to slow his breathing. Another shot cracked through the forest, splintering bark inches from Kowalski's head. The sharpshooter didn't flinch, tracking the muzzle flash and returning fire in one fluid motion. A distant grunt of pain told them he'd scored at least a hit. "We need to move," Keating decided. "He's keeping us pinned for the ground troops." They crawled through the underbrush, using every bit of cover available. The sniper fired twice more, but the shots went wide, suggesting Kowalski had wounded him. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when Monroe's strangled gasp made them freeze. Keating turned to see a German soldier standing not 10 feet away, rifle trained directly at them. He'd approached from their blind side, moving silently. Time seemed to slow. Keating's hand moved toward his sidearm, knowing he'd never draw it in time. Kowalski was facing the wrong direction, still watching for the sniper. The German's finger tightened on the trigger, and then Monroe's rifle barked, the sound deafening at close range. The German staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face. But he didn't fall. Monroe had hit him in the shoulder, a wound that would kill eventually but not immediately. The German swung his rifle toward Monroe, who sat frozen, unable to fire. Again. Keating lunged for his pistol. A second shot rang out, not from Keating or the German, but from the trees behind them. The German soldier dropped like a stone, a neat hole between his eyes. Mason emerged from the shadows, his rifle still trained on the fallen enemy. "Thought you could use some backup," he said casually. "Good thing I didn't listen to my own advice about splitting up." Keating exhaled slowly, the rush of adrenaline making his hands shake slightly. "Good thing," he agreed. "Where are Miller and Lowell?" "Circling around, there's a whole company of Krauts combing these woods for us." Mason looked at Monroe, who was staring at the German he'd shot. "Nice try, kid. Next time, aim center mass." Monroe nodded numbly, unable to tear his eyes away from the dead soldier. Kowalski searched the body quickly. "Feldwebel," he noted, pointing to the rank insignia. "Sergeant, these aren't just rear echelon troops. They're sending their best after us." A shout in German reminded them of their predicament. The search was closing in. "We need to divert them," Keating said. "Give them something else to chase." Mason raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that without sacrificing one of us as bait?" Keating looked at the dead German sergeant, an idea forming. "We don't sacrifice one of us, we use him." 10 minutes later, the sergeant's body, rigged with a grenade and timer, lay in a shallow depression 200 yards from their position. When the charge detonated, it would draw every German in the vicinity to investigate the firefight. "Clever," Mason admitted as they retreated, "but it only buys us time." "Time is all we need," Keating replied, though even he wasn't sure what they would do with that time yet. They rendezvoused with Miller and Lowell at the lightning tree, a massive oak split by a long-ago storm. The two soldiers reported similar experiences. Organized German search parties sweeping the forest in a methodical pattern. "Whoever's running this hunt knows what they're doing," Miller said grimly. "Military precision. They're tracking, not just searching." A distant explosion echoed through the trees, their diversion detonating right on schedule. German shouts followed, the search parties converging on the sound. "That'll keep them busy for 15 minutes, maybe 20, Keating said. "We need to use that time to get back on mission." He turned to Mason. "Did you see anything of the depot during your detour?" Mason nodded. "Increased activity. They're loading trucks, moving supplies out. I think our little ambush spooked them." This changed everything. If the Germans evacuated the depot before they could strike, Their entire mission would be for nothing. New plan, Keating decided. We hit the depot now while their forces are spread out looking for us. Mason looked skeptical. With 5 men? Against how many guards? It's our only shot, Keating insisted. They're not expecting us to double back toward them. We use the Panzerschreck to hit their fuel dump, create chaos, then grab whatever intelligence we can and get out. Before Mason could argue further, a new sound cut through the forest, the metallic click of a rifle bolt. They froze, weapons immediately raised. I wouldn't move if I were you, a cultured voice said in perfect, lightly accented English. From behind a pine stepped a tall German officer, his uniform impeccable despite the forest conditions. His Luger was aimed steadily at Keating's chest, and his cold blue eyes assessed each of the Americans with clinical detachment. Lieutenant Keating, I presume? The German officer said. I am Hauptmann Erich Jäger. You have caused me considerable inconvenience this morning. Keating's mind raced. How did the German know his name? Your confusion is understandable, Jäger continued. Did you really think we wouldn't identify the bodies of your men? Your dog tags are quite informative. He gestured with his pistol. Now order your men to drop their weapons. Keating assessed their situation. Jäger stood 10 yards away, too far to rush before he could fire. And though the German appeared to be alone, Keating had no doubt that reinforcements were close. Do as he says, Keating ordered quietly. One by one, the Americans lowered their weapons to the ground. All except Monroe, who stood rigid, his rifle still clutched in white-knuckled hands. Monroe, Keating said sharply. Put it down. The young private was trembling, his eyes fixed on Jäger with a mixture of terror and something harder, born of seeing too much death in too short a time. Private Monroe? Keating said again, his voice deliberately calm. That's an order. Slowly, reluctantly, Monroe lowered his rifle. Jäger nodded approvingly. Your men are well disciplined, Lieutenant. I respect that. He paused, head tilting, slightly. I find myself curious. Your attack this morning was well executed, if limited in scope. You clearly lack the manpower for a frontal assault on our position, yet you remain in the area, harassing our supply lines. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish? Keating said nothing, his face an impassive mask. No matter, Jäger continued after a moment. You are an advanced scout, perhaps, testing our defenses for a larger attack? He smiled thinly. Unfortunately for you, there will be no rescue. Your lines have pulled back 10 kilometers since yesterday. This was unwelcome news. If true, it meant they were even more isolated than they'd thought. You're lying, Mason growled. Jäger shrugged elegantly. Believe what you wish, it changes nothing. You and your men will be taken to... The crack of a rifle interrupted him. Jäger dropped instantly, rolling behind a tree with surprising agility. The Americans scattered for cover as German soldiers emerged from the surrounding forest, firing as they came. Kowalski rolled to his abandoned rifle, snatching it up and returning fire in one fluid motion. His first shot caught a German soldier in the throat. Mason had somehow recovered his own weapon and was providing covering fire, allowing Miller and Lowell to retrieve their arms. Only Monroe remained exposed, seemingly paralyzed by the suddenness of the attack. Monroe, get down, Keating shouted, already diving toward the private. Time seemed to slow as Keating saw Jäger emerge from cover, his Luger aimed squarely at Monroe's chest. The German captain's face showed no anger, no triumph, only the cold calculation of a man doing his duty. Keating tackled Monroe an instant before Jäger fired. The bullet passed harmlessly overhead as both Americans crashed to the forest floor. Rolling onto his back, Keating drew his sidearm and squeezed off 2 shots at Jäger, forcing the German officer back into cover. Fall back. 30 yards, rally point, Keating ordered, pulling Monroe to his feet. What followed was a chaotic fighting retreat. The Americans moved from tree to tree, covering each other in practiced leapfrog movements. The Germans pursued, doggedly, but Jäger seemed to be holding them in check, preventing them from simply overwhelming the outnumbered Americans with firepower. He's playing with us, Mason grunted as they paused behind a rocky outcropping, Could have flanked us 3 times by now. Keating nodded grimly. He wants prisoners, not bodies. He checked his ammunition. 4 rounds left in his pistol, a single magazine for his carbine. Monroe sat with his back against the rock, his face ashen. I froze, he whispered. I could have gotten us all killed. But you didn't. Keating replied simply. Now focus up, we're not dead yet. German voices echoed through the trees. Closer now, more confident. Kowalski stiffened. They're surrounding us. 3-point movement. They'll pin us here and pick us off one by one. Keating looked at his men, exhausted, wounded, but still defiant. Lowell, how many grenades did you grab from that truck? 3 frags, 1 smoke. Miller, the Panzerschreck, ready with 2 rockets. Keating nodded, a plan forming. We're going to create a hole and punch through it. Due east, back toward the depot. Mason raised an eyebrow. Running right back to their headquarters? That's your plan? It's the last thing they'll expect, Keating replied. And right now, Yeager has most of his men out here hunting us. The depot will be undermanned. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mason sighed. Your funeral. Let's do it. Lowell crawled to the edge of their cover, grenades ready. Miller positioned the Panzerschreck, sighting along its crude mechanisms toward a cluster of trees where several Germans had taken position. On my mark, Keating said quietly. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The forest erupted once more into chaos. Lowell's grenade sailed through the air, detonating among the German positions. Miller fired the Panzerschreck, its rocket hissing through the trees to explode against a fallen log that had sheltered 3 enemy soldiers. Go! 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 Keating shouted. They burst from cover, firing as they ran. German bullets whined past, them chipping bark from trees and kicking up dirt. But the sudden assault had achieved its purpose. Momentary confusion in the German ranks. Kowalski dropped to one knee, his rifle cracking 3 times in rapid succession. 3 German soldiers fell. Clear, he called, already running to catch up. They plunged deeper into the forest, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. Behind them, German shouts turned from confident to confused. They had lost track of their prey. After 5 minutes of hard running, Keating called a halt. They gathered behind a dense thicket, chests heaving. Did we lose them? Monroe gasped. Temporarily, Keating replied. Yeager's too good to lose us for long. We need to keep moving. Kowalski paused, his head cocked to one side. Wait, listen. Through the trees came the distant sound of engines, many engines, moving fast. Vehicles on the forest road, Mason confirmed, heading away from the depot. Keating felt a surge of hope. They're evacuating. That means the depot will be even more vulnerable. Or it means they're bringing in reinforcements, Mason countered. Only one way to find out, Keating said, checking his compass. We stick to the plan, hit the depot, grab what intelligence we can, and get out. He looked at each of his men. This could be our only chance to make all of this. All the men we've lost mean something. One by one they nodded, even Monroe, whose eyes had taken on a new hardness. As they set out toward the depot, Keating couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing into Yeager's hands. The German captain had seemed almost amused by their resistance, but predictable or not, they had no choice. The mission came first. Behind them, unseen in the shadows, Hauptmann Yeager watched their departure through his binoculars, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Run, little Americans, he murmured. The hunt is just beginning. I'm done running. Lieutenant. Keating's voice was low as he crouched behind an oak. Dawn filtered through the mist-shrouded forest. He'd been studying the terrain map recovered from the dead German sergeant. With all due respect, sir, we don't have much choice, Mason replied, scanning the forest. Yeager's got at least 2 platoons combing these woods, and we're down to 5 men. Keating shook his head. That's exactly why we can't keep running. We're outnumbered, low on ammo, and deep in enemy territory. If we keep playing defense, we die. So what's your plan? Kowalski asked. We don't march through them, Keating said, his eyes glinting with a hard light. "We make them march through us." He pointed to a narrow ravine on the map. "Here, this is where we make our stand." The ravine was a perfect natural kill zone, steep walls rising 30 feet on either side, with only a narrow passage through. According to the map, it was one of the few viable routes between their position and the German supply depot. "We set up a defensive position here," Keating continued. "Booby traps throughout the gully, Kowalski up high with a clear line of fire. The rest of us dug in with overlapping fields of fire." "And how do we get Jaeger and his men to walk into our little trap?" Mason asked skeptically. Keating's face hardened. "We give him what he wants. Me." 2 hours later, Keating crouched alone halfway up the eastern wall of the ravine. Below him, the narrow gully stretched like a scar through the forest floor, dotted with carefully positioned debris concealing Lowell's improvised explosives. He'd deliberately left signs of his passage at the southern approach: broken branches, disturbed earth, even a discarded canteen with his name stenciled on it. A trail so obvious that even an amateur would find it suspicious. But Jaeger's eagerness might override his caution. On the opposite wall, Kowalski lay in wait with his rifle. Mason, Miller, and Monroe were positioned at the northern end, where the ravine narrowed into a bottleneck. The first sign of the Germans came just after noon. A scout emerged from the clearing, checking the ground carefully before waving his comrades forward. 4 men, then 8, then a dozen formed a loose skirmish line. Jaeger appeared at the rear of the formation. Even from a distance, his bearing was unmistakable: tall, straight-backed, moving with a predator's grace. He carried a Gewehr 43 rifle rather than an officer's typical sidearm. The German point man found the canteen, examining it before passing it back to Jaeger. Keating could see the captain's satisfied smile as he read the name. The Germans began to move into the ravine. Keating held his breath, counting silently. 12 men in the ravine now. 13. 14. Jaeger paused at the entrance, surveying the terrain with a critical eye. For a moment, Keating thought he would order his men back, but then the German captain stepped forward. 15 Germans in the kill zone. Keating lifted his hand, clutching the thin wire that ran to the first of Lowell's mines. He took a deep breath and pulled. The explosion wasn't large, but it was perfectly placed. The charge detonated beneath a loose slope of scree, sending hundreds of pounds of rock and dirt cascading down on the Germans at the rear. Screams filled the air as men were buried or crushed. Before the echoes died away, Keating yanked the second wire. This charge was positioned under a dead tree on the opposite wall. The explosion severed the trunk, sending it tumbling down, crushing 1 soldier outright and pinning 2 more. Chaos erupted below. German soldiers dove for cover, shouting in confusion. That's when Kowalski opened fire. The sharpshooter's first round took a German sergeant in the back of the head. His second found a machine gunner struggling to set up his weapon. 3 seconds, 2 shots, 2 dead. From the northern end, Mason, Miller, and Monroe opened up with withering fire, catching the disoriented Germans in a brutal crossfire. In the first 15 seconds, half of Jaeger's men were dead or wounded. Keating allowed himself a grim smile before drawing a bead on a German soldier trying to climb the ravine wall. He squeezed the trigger twice, and the man tumbled back down, leaving a dark smear on the slope. But the Germans weren't green recruits. Even caught in the trap, they responded with disciplined counterfire, forcing the Americans to duck back into cover. A burst from a German MP-40 sent rock fragments flying into Keating's face. He rolled to a new position, searching for Jaeger. The German captain had taken cover behind the fallen tree, calmly directing his men's fire, organizing what should have been a panicked rout into a coordinated defense. "Kowalski!" Keating shouted. "The officer! Take the officer!" The sharpshooter's rifle cracked, but Jaeger had already moved, seeming to anticipate the shot with uncanny precision. The tide was beginning to turn. The surviving Germans had established firing positions and were methodically working to suppress the American ambush. One had set up a light machine gun, its chattering bursts keeping Mason's group pinned down. Keating realized they had perhaps 2 minutes before the Germans would fight their way clear. He needed to end this now. His hand found the third and final wire. This last charge was their largest, positioned beneath an unstable section of the ravine wall directly above where most of the surviving Germans had taken cover. When it blew, it would bring down tons of earth and stone, burying everything beneath. It was no longer an ambush. It was an execution. Keating hesitated, his schoolteacher's conscience warring with his soldier's instinct. These men were just following orders, same as his own troops. But they were also the enemy. The same enemy that had shredded his platoon with machine gun fire, that hunted them through the woods like animals. A shout from above drew his attention. Kowalski was frantically pointing toward the forest beyond the southern entrance. Keating squinted, then felt his blood run cold. Reinforcements. At least 20 more German soldiers double-timing it toward the ravine. Keating yanked the wire with all his strength. The explosion was deafening, immediately followed by the deeper rumble of collapsing earth. The entire section of the ravine wall peeled away, cascading down in a churning wave of dirt, rocks, and broken trees. German screams were cut short as the avalanche crashed over their positions. Within seconds, the floor of the ravine had been transformed into a chaotic jumble of debris, with arms and legs protruding grotesquely from the earth. "Pull back!" Keating shouted. "Rendezvous at checkpoint Bravo!" He scrambled up the ravine wall. The Germans would be on them in minutes. At the top, he paused for a fraction of a second, scanning the devastation below. At least a dozen German soldiers lay dead or dying. But of Jaeger, there was no sign. No time to worry about that now. The reinforcements were less than 200 yards away. Keating ran, pushing through the dense undergrowth. After 5 minutes, he reached checkpoint Bravo, a lightning-struck pine on a small rise. Mason and Miller were already there. A minute later, Monroe staggered in. But there was no sign of Kowalski. "Where's Kowalski?" Keating demanded. Mason shook his head grimly. "Last I saw, he was providing covering fire. German got a lucky shot, clipped him in the leg. He waved us on, said he'd catch up. We need to go back for him," Monroe said, already turning. "Negative," Mason replied, grabbing the young private's arm. "Those Kraut reinforcements will have the whole area swarming by now. We go back there, we're dead." "So we just leave him?" Monroe's voice cracked with disbelief. Keating felt the weight of command press down on him. Every instinct screamed to go back for his man, but the cold calculus of war told a different story. 1 life against 4. A suicide mission against the slim chance of completing their objective. "We can't help Kowalski if we're dead," he said finally. "We continue the mission." Monroe stared at him in shock. "But sir, that's an order, Private," Keating snapped. "Kowalski knew the risks." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he forced himself to continue. "We head for checkpoint Charlie, link up with Doc Walsh and the wounded. Then we make for the depot as planned." They moved at a grueling pace, avoiding German patrols. By the time they reached checkpoint Charlie, a small cave formed by an overhanging rock, the afternoon was waning. Doc Walsh greeted them with visible relief, emerging from the shadows with his medical bag. Behind him, Peterson lay on an improvised stretcher, his face gray with pain. "Where's Fitzgerald?" Mason asked, noticing the absence of their other wounded man. Walsh's expression told the story. "Lost him an hour ago. Internal bleeding. Nothing I could do." His voice was hollow, empty of the compassion that had once defined him. He just bled out. Kept asking for his mother at the end. Keating nodded grimly. "And Peterson?" "Holding on, but barely," Walsh replied. "He needs a real hospital, real soon." "That's not happening," Keating said bluntly. "Not until we complete the mission." Walsh looked up, his eyes flashing with sudden anger. "The mission? These men are dying, Lieutenant. They're dying while we play hide-and-seek in the goddamn forest." "You think I don't know that?" Keating shot back. "You think I want to be out here watching my men die one by one? I didn't ask for this mission, Doc. But we're here, and we're going to see it through." At what cost? Walsh demanded, gesturing to Peterson. How many more have to die before you admit this is suicide? As many as it takes, Keating replied coldly. That depot is important enough that command was willing to sacrifice our entire platoon to capture it. That means it's important enough for us to finish the job. The medic stared at him, horror dawning in his eyes. Jesus, Keating. Listen to yourself. That's not you talking. That's some machine they've turned you into. For a moment, the lieutenant said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unyielding. Machine or not, I'm still your commanding officer, and we are going to complete this mission. He turned to the others. Get Peterson ready to move. We're Oscar Mike in 5. As the men prepared, Mason approached him privately. Walsh isn't wrong, you know, he said in a low voice. You're changing, LT. Getting harder. Colder. We're all changing, Keating replied tonelessly. That's what war does. Mason shook his head. This is different. The way you pulled that last wire, knowing what it would do. That wasn't a soldier making a tactical decision. That was something else. Keating met his sergeant's gaze unflinchingly. Are you questioning my command, Sergeant? No, sir, Mason answered after a pause. Just reminding you who we're fighting for, who we're supposed to be. Before Keating could respond, a sound froze them all in place, the snap of a twig, followed by movement through undergrowth. Someone was approaching the cave. Weapons were instantly raised. Keating signaled for silence. A figure stumbled from the trees, listing heavily to one side. Blood darkened the left leg of his uniform, and he clutched a rifle like a crutch. Kowalski, Monroe breathed in disbelief. The sharpshooter managed a pained grin. Miss me? Keating felt a surge of relief so powerful it left him momentarily speechless. Mason was already moving to help Kowalski. How did you make it out? Miller asked, passing the sharpshooter his canteen. Pure luck. When that last charge blew, it sent half the ravine down on the Krauts. I managed to slip out in the confusion. He grimaced as Walsh examined his wounded leg. Took a round through the thigh. Hurts like a son of a bitch, but didn't hit anything vital. What about the Germans? Keating asked. How many did we get? A lot, Kowalski replied grimly. At least 15, maybe 20. But there's more coming, LT. I saw vehicles on the road. They're bringing in reinforcements from all over. And Jaeger? He asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Alive. I saw him after the collapse organizing the survivors. He took a piece of shrapnel to the face, nasty gash across his cheek, but he was up and moving. He paused. He's different. Now, LT. Before, he was just hunting us. Now it's personal. Keating nodded slowly. He'd felt the same shift in himself, the crossing of some invisible line that separated clinical military operations from blood vendetta. Then we'd better not be here when he comes looking, he said. We move in 2 minutes, head east, then circle north toward the depot. We've rattled them, and that's good, but now we need to finish this before they can regroup. As the men prepared to move out, Keating found himself alone for a moment. He realized his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the aftermath of what he'd done. Pulling that last wire had changed something fundamental inside him. The line between necessary killing and murder had blurred, and he wasn't sure he could find it again. But there was no time for moral anguish. His men were looking to him for leadership, for the next step in this desperate game of survival. With a deep breath, Keating pushed his doubts aside and rejoined his men. Move out, he ordered, his voice steady once more. Stay low, stay quiet, we're not done yet. As they slipped back into the forest, shadows among shadows, Keating couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the gathering darkness, Jaeger was still tracking them. Wounded but not broken, his determination only hardened by the day's events. The hunt wasn't over. It had barely begun. Night fell over the Hürtgenwald, bringing with it a cold mist that slithered between the trees. 7 men lay on a wooded ridge studying the German stronghold below. The stone structure, once a hunting lodge, now bristled with machine gun emplacements and searchlights cutting lazy arcs through the fog. Keating studied the building through Kowalski's field glasses, counting guards and noting patrol patterns. Beside him, Mason sketched the perimeter defenses. "Lighter security than I expected," Keating murmured. "Maybe 20 men visible, mostly at the east and south entrances." "They think they scared us off," Mason replied. "Or most of their manpower is still out in the forest looking for us." "Or it's a trap," Kowalski added, shifting his wounded leg. Keating nodded. "Maybe. But we don't have much choice." He turned to Monroe, who lay just behind them. "What do you think? You've been watching them longer than I have." Monroe blinked in surprise at being consulted. The young replacement had changed, the terror in his eyes replaced by something harder, more focused. "The guard rotations are sloppy," Monroe said. "They change every 2 hours, but there's a 5-minute gap on the west side between shifts. And they're drinking. I saw one guard pass a flask to another." Keating nodded approvingly. "Good eye, that's our window." He turned back to study the Stronghold. "The question is, what exactly are we looking at? Command sent us to take this position but never told us why." "Supply depot like we thought," Mason said. "But there's something else. Look at the northeast corner, second floor. That room with the blacked-out windows? They've got a guard posted outside, even though it's inside the perimeter." Keating squinted through the field glasses. Mason was right. A single guard stood at rigid attention outside a door, his posture suggesting elite troops rather than the usual rear echelon personnel. "They're protecting something," Keating mused. "Something important." "Intelligence, maybe?" Walsh suggested. The medic had been quiet since their confrontation at the cave. That would explain why Command was so keen on taking this place. Only one way to find out, Keating decided. "We need someone to get inside, scout the layout, and see what we're dealing with before we commit to an assault." A moment of silence followed as each man considered the near-suicide mission. "I'll go," Monroe said suddenly. All eyes turned to the young private. "No offense, kid," Mason started, "but—" "I'm the smallest," Monroe interrupted, "and the quietest. And I've been watching their patrol patterns for hours." Something in his voice had changed, a determination that hadn't been there before. "I can do this, sir." Keating studied Monroe carefully. The private who had frozen in his first firefight, who had nearly given away their position to a German patrol, that young man was gone. In his place was a soldier with steady hands and a set jaw. "Are you sure?" Keating asked quietly. Monroe nodded once. "Yes, sir." "All right," Keating decided. "You go in through the west entrance during the guard. Change. Your objective is to determine the layout, enemy strength, and what they're protecting in that northeast room. No heroics, no engagement unless absolutely necessary. Get in, get the information, get out. You'll have 30 minutes. Monroe absorbed these instructions, his face betraying no fear, only grim acceptance. He stripped down to the essentials, his M1 carbine, 3 magazines, a combat knife, and a single grenade. 22 minutes until the next guard change, Mason noted. You should move into position now. Monroe gave a tight nod and began to ease backward from their observation post. Before he could disappear into the darkness, Keating caught his arm. "Monroe," he said quietly, "you've come a long way since that first day in the forest. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that." Something flickered in the young private's eyes, perhaps pride, perhaps fear. Then it was gone, replaced by soldier's focus. "Thank you, sir." With that, he melted into the shadows. Keating turned back to the others. "We give him 30 minutes. Then we go in, one way or another." The minutes crawled by. Through the field, glasses. Keating watched the guard change that would be Monroe's window of opportunity. Right on schedule, the west entrance stood momentarily unattended as one shift departed and another approached. "He's in," Kowalski murmured, his sniper's eyes picking out details others missed. East corner, ground floor window. Clean entry. Keating exhaled slowly. Now we wait. The seconds ticked away. Keating used the time to finalize their assault. Plan. Kowalski would set up on the ridge with his rifle. Mason and Miller would take the west entrance, creating a diversion. Walsh would remain with Peterson near their fallback position. Keating himself would lead Lowell through the east entrance, targeting the mysterious room on the second floor. 20 minutes left, Mason reported softly. Keating nodded, calculating their odds. They had the Panzerschreck with one remaining rocket, a handful of grenades, and whatever ammunition they'd scavenged, against a fortified position with at least 20 defenders. 10 minutes, Mason whispered. Keating raised the field glasses again, scanning for any sign of alarm. The guards maintained their regular patrols. The searchlights continued their lazy sweeps. 5 minutes. 2 minutes. Keating tightened his grip on his weapon. Get ready to move. If he's not back, we... A flicker of movement in the underbrush below cut him off. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, moving with urgent purpose toward their position. Monroe. Relief flooded through Keating, followed immediately by concern as he noted the private's haste. Monroe wasn't moving with careful stealth. He was running, consequences be damned. Something had gone wrong. Monroe scrambled up the ridge, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Blood spattered his uniform, not his own, Keating noted with grim understanding. "Sir," Monroe gasped, dropping to his knees beside Keating. "Sir, you need to see this. The Stronghold, it's not just a supply depot. It's..." He fumbled in his jacket, producing a folded sheaf of papers. "It's a forward command center. For something big. Something they're calling Wacht am Rhein." Keating took the papers, squinting to make out the German text in the dim light. Certain phrases jumped out at him. Panzer divisions, Ardennes, breakthrough, December offensive. Jesus Christ, he breathed, the implications sinking in. They're planning a major counteroffensive through the Ardennes, and soon. Mason leaned in, his expression grim. "How many divisions?" Monroe shook his head. "I couldn't tell for sure. The documents were spread across a table, maps, orders, deployment schedules. But it's big. Bigger than anything we've seen since D-Day. And that's not all." He reached into his jacket again, producing a set of technical drawings. "They've got some kind of new anti-tank weapon. More advanced than anything we've got. They're calling it a Panzerfaust 2I-50. Keating examined the schematics, a chill running down his spine. If these were accurate, the Germans had developed a man-portable anti-tank weapon with greater range and penetration than anything in the Allied arsenal. Combined with a surprise offensive through what Allied command considered an impenetrable forest. "We need to get these back to headquarters," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "This changes everything." "Sir," Monroe said hesitantly, "there's something else. I had to kill a guard inside. He wasn't supposed to be there. Must have been relieving himself. He spotted me coming out of the communications room. I tried to take him quietly, but..." He swallowed hard. I hesitated just for a second. He got a shout out before I could silence him. As if to confirm his words, an alarm suddenly blared from the Stronghold. Searchlights began sweeping more urgently across the perimeter, and guards rushed to defensive positions. "They know someone infiltrated," Monroe finished unnecessarily. "They don't know about us up here yet, but they will soon. They're already checking the woods." Keating processed this rapidly. The element of surprise was gone, but the intelligence they'd acquired was too valuable to risk losing in a retreat. "Change of plans," he announced, folding the papers carefully and securing them in his waterproof map case. "We're still taking that Stronghold, but now we've got a reason beyond survival. Those papers could save thousands of American lives if they reach headquarters in time. Or we could just take the papers and run," Mason countered. "Live to fight. Another day. Command never expected us to succeed in the first place. They'll be thrilled if we just bring back this intelligence. Keating shook his head. They'll send search parties into these woods. With Jaeger leading them, they'll find our trail, run us down before we get halfway to our lines. Our only chance is to take that stronghold, use their radio to call for extraction, and hold until help arrives. He looked at each of his men in turn, seeing the understanding dawn in their eyes. This was no longer just about their survival. It was about something larger, perhaps the course of the war itself. Besides, Keating added grimly, if these papers are right, that stronghold contains plans and equipment that could turn the tide in the Germans' favor. We can't let that happen. One by one, his men nodded their agreement. Even Walsh, who had been the most vocal critic of continuing the mission, gave a reluctant nod. What's the play then? Mason asked. Keating studied the stronghold, now abuzz, with activity as guards swept the perimeter with flashlights and dogs. We can't wait. If they discover we have those documents, they'll bring in every available unit to hunt us down. We hit them now, hard and fast before they can organize a proper search. He outlined the modified plan rapidly. Miller would fire their last Panzerschreck round at the main generator, plunging the stronghold into darkness. In the confusion, Keating and Mason would lead the assault through the east entrance, targeting the communications room first to prevent the Germans from calling for reinforcements. Kowalski, you'll stay here with your rifle. Pick off anyone trying to escape, with documents or equipment. Walsh, you and Peterson remain at the fallback position. If we're not back in 2 hours, assume we failed and make your way back to our lines with the intelligence. Like hell, Walsh protested. I'm coming with you. Peterson's stable enough to leave with the documents, and you'll need a medic. Inside. Keating wanted to argue, but the medic was right. They would likely need his skills before the night was over. Fine. Monroe, any other intelligence on the layout inside? The private quickly sketched the interior as he'd seen it. 2 floors with the communications and intelligence center on the second level, northeast corner. The ground floor contained barracks, a mess hall, and storage rooms filled with supplies and ammunition. Approximately 15 guards inside, plus whatever officers were manning the command center. Hauptmann Jaeger? Keating asked, dreading the answer. Monroe shook his head. No sign of him, but there was a lot of activity in the command center. Senior officers planning something big. If he's involved in this offensive, he might be on his way back to report on our status. That was something, at least. Facing the German captain on his home ground would have further reduced their already slim chances. All right, Keating said, checking his weapon one final time. We move in 5 minutes. Questions? There were none. Each man knew his role, understood the stakes. They began their final preparations in silence. Keating found himself watching Monroe, who was methodically loading his magazines with steady hands. The blood on his uniform had dried to a dark brown, a grim testament to the young man's first kill. There was no shaking now, no wide-eyed terror, just the focused preparation of a soldier readying himself for battle. Monroe, Keating said quietly, moving to the private side. That guard? First time you've killed up close? Monroe nodded, not looking up from his task. Yes, sir. Not like I thought it would be. It never is, Keating replied simply. You did what had to be done, remember that. I keep seeing his face, Monroe admitted, his voice barely audible. The way he looked at me when he realized he was dying, like he couldn't understand what was happening. Keating placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. That feeling doesn't go away, not completely, but you learn to carry it. How? Monroe asked, finally looking up. By remembering that we're all just men following orders, Keating said. Him, you, me. We do what we must to survive, to protect our brothers, to serve something larger than ourselves. There's no shame in that. Monroe absorbed this, then nodded once. Thank you, sir. Time, Mason called softly. Keating turned to address his men. No grand speech came to mind. In the end, he settled for simplicity. Whatever happens next, he said, it's been an honor serving with you. Let's finish this. With that, they moved out, spreading into their assigned positions. Miller set up the Panzerschreck, sighting on the generator building. Kowalski settled into a sniper's nest with a clear view of the compound. The others began their cautious advance toward the Stronghold's perimeter. Halfway down the ridge, a sudden commotion at the Stronghold's main gate froze them in place. Vehicles were arriving. 3 canvas-covered trucks and a staff car, their headlights cutting through the mist. The guards snapped to attention. Barriers were raised and the small convoy rolled into the compound. Keating trained his field glasses on the scene, a sense of foreboding building in his chest. The staff car stopped at the main entrance and a tall figure emerged, his bearing unmistakable even at this distance. Hauptmann Jäger had returned. The German captain stood illuminated in the headlights for a moment, giving orders to the men around him. Even from this distance, Keating could see the angry red gash across Jäger's cheek, a souvenir from the ravine ambush. Then the captain turned, looking out into the darkness of the forest with an expression of grim determination. For a heart-stopping moment, Keating could have sworn Jäger was looking directly at him, as if the German officer could sense his presence through the darkness and mist. Then the captain turned and strode into the Stronghold, the men around him scrambling to follow. "Well, that complicates things," Mason muttered beside him. Keating nodded grimly. "Jäger knows these woods better than we do. If he suspects we're close, he'll lock down that Stronghold tight and send out search parties. We might still have surprise on our side," Mason suggested. "He can't know we're planning to attack the Stronghold itself, probably thinks we're still running for our lines." "Maybe," Keating conceded. "Or maybe he knows exactly what we're doing. Either way, we're out of time." He keyed his throat mic. "All units, execute now. I repeat, execute now." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the night erupted into chaos. Miller's Panzerschreck roared to life, its rocket streaking through the darkness to slam into the generator building. The explosion was deafening, followed by secondary detonations as fuel storage tanks ignited. A fireball rose above the Stronghold, momentarily turning night to day before the entire compound was plunged into darkness as the power failed. In the sudden blackness, Keating's team moved. Racing across the open ground toward the east entrance, they encountered the first resistance. 2 guards, blinded by the sudden darkness, firing wildly toward the explosion. Keating and Mason took them down with synchronized bursts from their weapons. They reached the east entrance without further resistance, stacking up on either side of the heavy wooden door. Inside, they could hear shouts of confusion, orders being barked in German, the sound of men rushing to defensive positions. Keating caught Mason's eye, saw the same grim determination reflected there that he felt in his own heart. With a nod, he pulled the pin on a grenade, waited 2 seconds, then tossed it through the partially open door. The explosion sent wood splinters and screams into the night. Keating was moving before the smoke cleared, storming through the shattered doorway with his weapon at the ready. Mason was right behind him, followed by Monroe, Walsh, and Lowell. Their assault on the Stronghold had begun. But as they plunged into the darkened building, met almost immediately by determined German resistance, one thought dominated Keating's mind. Somewhere in this chaos, Hauptmann Jäger was waiting for them. And this time, only one of them would walk away. The world became chaos of smoke, gunfire, and screams. Keating moved through the darkened corridor, weapon ready. Mason and Monroe followed, with Walsh and Lowell covering their rear. 2 Germans lay dead by the entrance. Miller's Panzerschreck had knocked out power, plunging the interior into darkness. Only emergency lanterns and muzzle flashes illuminated their path. "Command center is northeast, 2nd floor," Keating whispered at a junction. "And Jäger?" Mason asked, checking his ammunition. "One problem at a time." German shouting echoed. From ahead, boots pounded on wooden floors as soldiers rushed to positions. "Monroe," Keating said, "you know the layout. Take point." There wasn't a flicker of hesitation in Monroe's eyes as he nodded and moved ahead. The transformation from terrified replacement to hardened soldier was complete. He slipped into the lead position with a veteran's natural grace. They encountered their first resistance at the stairwell, 3 Germans setting up a machine gun. Monroe spotted them first, dropping to one knee and firing 2 quick bursts. 2 Germans fell immediately. The third managed to squeeze off several rounds before Mason's shot took him in the throat. The machine gun fire had torn chunks from the wooden banister inches from Monroe's head, but the private seemed unfazed. He simply rose, checked the fallen Germans for ammunition, and continued up the stairs. At the top, the corridor split. To the left lay the barracks, to the right the command center. As Monroe started right, a door to the left burst open. A German officer emerged, pistol in hand. Monroe reacted instantly, his rifle barking twice. The officer collapsed, but not before. His pistol discharged. "Check the rooms as we go," Keating ordered. "Don't leave enemies at our back." They moved methodically down the corridor, clearing rooms one by one. In one, they found a radio operator trying to call for reinforcements. Mason silenced him with a single shot. The command center was just ahead. Keating could hear activity behind the closed door. "Stack up," he ordered, taking position beside the door. "Mason, you're first through. Monroe, follow. Walsh, Lowell, secure our rear. On 3. Mason kicked the door open, immediately diving and rolling to the right as gunfire erupted from within. Monroe was a step behind, moving left and dropping, to one knee, his rifle already tracking targets. Keating followed last, sweeping the center of the room. Inside, chaos reigned. Maps and documents were being hastily gathered by panicked staff officers. Guards had formed a defensive line behind overturned desks. And in the center, standing calmly amid the pandemonium, was Hauptmann Erich Jäger. The German captain was a striking figure, tall with the bearing of a man born to command. The wound on his cheek from the ravine ambush had been hastily bandaged. His cold blue eyes immediately found Keating's. For a heartbeat, the two officers stared at each other across the room. Then the moment shattered as the guards opened fire. "Cover!" Keating shouted, diving behind a heavy desk as bullets tore through the space he'd occupied. The room erupted into a chaotic firefight. Mason and Monroe had taken positions by the doorway, methodically picking off German soldiers. Keating recovered and joined them, his carbine chattering as he targeted a machine gun nest in the far corner. Through the smoke, Keating caught glimpses of Jäger directing his men, falling back toward a secondary door. The German captain was orchestrating an organized retreat while ensuring the most critical documents were secured. "He's trying to escape with the intelligence," Keating shouted. To Mason, "We need to cut him off." Monroe heard the order and immediately responded, breaking from cover and rushing along the left wall in a flanking maneuver. His sudden movement drew fire from the German defenders, but he moved with such speed that their shots went wide. "Covering. Fire," Keating ordered, standing to deliver a sustained burst that forced the Germans to duck. Monroe reached the far side of the room, positioning himself to intercept Jäger and the officers attempting to flee with the documents. The young private took aim at a German major who was clutching a leather portfolio, likely containing the critical intelligence. But as Monroe squeezed the trigger, Jäger seemed to sense the danger. The German captain shoved the major aside, and in the same fluid motion drew his Luger, firing twice at Monroe. The first round missed. The second didn't. Monroe staggered, his rifle clattering to the floor as his hands clutched at his chest. Bright arterial blood seeped between his fingers, his eyes wide with shock rather than pain. "Monroe!" Keating shouted, already moving toward the fallen soldier. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jäger could have easily finished Monroe with another shot. Instead, he grabbed the portfolio from the stunned major and barked an order to his remaining men, before disappearing through the rear door. Keating reached Monroe as the private collapsed to his knees. He caught the young soldier before he could fall, lowering him gently to the floor. Blood was spreading rapidly across Monroe's uniform, the wound pumping with each faltering heartbeat. "Doc," Keating called, cradling Monroe's head. "Doc." Walsh was already moving, his medical bag in hand, dodging bullets as he crossed the room. Around them, the firefight continued, but it had taken on a distant quality in Keating's mind. "Stay with me, kid," Keating said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Doc's coming, you're gonna be fine." Monroe looked up, his eyes clear and surprisingly calm. "Sir," he managed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "The documents, Jaeger. Don't worry about that now," Keating replied, applying pressure to the wound. "Just focus on breathing." Walsh reached them, immediately cutting away Monroe's uniform to assess the damage. One look at the wound told the story. The bullet had punctured the aorta. No field medicine could save him. "Sir," Walsh said quietly, meeting Keating's eyes with a slight shake of his head. Monroe seemed to understand. A faint smile crossed his lips. "Did I do good, Lieutenant?" Keating swallowed hard. "You did great, kid. Better than any of us could have asked for." Monroe's hand found Keating's, squeezing with surprising strength. Tell my mom." "I will," Keating promised. "I'll tell her how brave you were, how you saved us all." The young soldier's eyes began to lose focus, but the smile remained. "I wasn't scared this time," he whispered. "Funny how that works." His grip slackened, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The transformation was complete, from boy to soldier to memory, in the space of 3 days. Keating gently closed Monroe's eyes, a cold rage building inside him. He stood, retrieving his weapon from where he'd dropped it. "Mason," he called, his voice unnaturally calm. "Secure this room. Walsh, stay with Monroe. Lowell, with me." He checked his ammunition. "Jaeger went through that door. He has the documents we need." "Sir," Mason said, glancing at Monroe's body, "should we wait for reinforcements?" Keating's eyes hardened. "No time. Every second we wait is another second Jaeger gets closer to escape." Without waiting for a response, Keating moved toward the rear door, Lowell following close behind. The door led to a narrow corridor that ended at a metal staircase, a service access to the roof. Bootprints in the dust showed that multiple people had recently passed this way. "They're going for a helicopter extraction," Lowell suggested. "I saw a landing pad on the roof during our approach." They took the stairs 2 at a time, weapons ready. At the top, a heavy metal door stood partially open, cold night air whistling through the gap. Keating paused, listening. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors spooling up reached his ears. "We've got maybe 2 minutes," he whispered to Lowell. "Go left when we exit. I'll go right." They burst through the door together, immediately splitting as planned. The roof was broad and flat, surrounded by a waist-high stone parapet. At the far eastern edge, a small aircraft sat on the pad, its rotors already turning. 3 figures were rushing toward it, 2 officers and Jaeger clutching the portfolio. Keating didn't hesitate. He raised his carbine and fired a sustained burst at the helicopter. The rounds tore through the engine block. Black smoke billowed from the damaged aircraft and the pilot immediately cut power. The German officers scattered, diving for cover. Jaeger, however, turned to face the threat, dropping the portfolio and drawing his Luger in one smooth motion. Keating fired again, but his magazine clicked empty. Jaeger was already advancing, firing methodically. The German's first shot missed. His second grazed Keating's left arm. Lowell opened fire from the other side of the roof, forcing Jaeger to take cover behind an air conditioning unit. The momentary respite gave Keating time to draw his sidearm. He squeezed off 2 rounds in Jaeger's direction. "The portfolio," Keating shouted to Lowell, gesturing toward the leather case lying abandoned near the helicopter. "Get the documents." Lowell broke from cover, racing toward the fallen portfolio. He was halfway there when one of the German officers rose from behind a ventilation duct, rifle aimed. Keating shouted a warning, but it came too late. The rifle cracked and Lowell stumbled, a red stain blossoming on his back. The young soldier fell forward, sliding across the roof surface before coming to rest just inches from the portfolio. Keating fired at the German officer, forcing him back into cover. But now he was alone. Lowell was down, possibly dead, and Mason was still securing the command center below. It was just him and Jaeger with 2 other German officers as wild cards. "Lieutenant Keating," Jaeger's voice called, cultured and controlled. "I must admit I underestimated you and your men. A mistake I will not repeat. Keating didn't respond, using the German's voice to pinpoint his location, behind an electrical transformer about 20 yards away. You fought admirably, Jaeger continued. But surely you see the futility of your position. You're outnumbered, cut off from support. Even if you somehow escape this roof, my reinforcements will be here within minutes. Funny, Keating called, back shifting position silently as he spoke. I was about to say the same thing to you. My men have secured the compound. Your helicopter is disabled. Seems to me you're the one who's trapped. A soft chuckle reached his ears. Perhaps we are both trapped then. A fitting end to our little game of cat and mouse. But I am curious. What will you do with that intelligence if you get it? Your lines have pulled back, you're alone in enemy territory. The odds of you reaching friendly forces are minimal. I'll take those odds, Keating replied, now moving steadily along the parapet toward Lowell's fallen form. If he could reach the portfolio. Of course you will, Jaeger said, his voice taking on an almost admiring quality. You're a man who believes in duty above all else. Above reason, above self-preservation, above the lives of your men. We are not so different, you and I. The comparison struck Keating like a physical blow. Was that true? Had he become like Jaeger, cold, calculating, viewing his men as mere pieces on a chessboard? Monroe's face flashed in his mind, the light fading from the young soldier's eyes as he died believing he'd done something that mattered. We're nothing alike, Keating growled, the rage inside him building. No, we both serve ideologies larger than ourselves. We both sacrifice others to achieve our objectives. The only difference is the flag we salute. Keating had reached the edge of the parapet. Lowell lay just 10 yards away, the portfolio tantalizingly close to his outstretched hand. But to reach it, Keating would have to expose himself completely. A sudden movement to his left caught his attention. One of the German officers was making a dash for the portfolio. Without thinking, Keating rose and fired twice. The officer spun and fell, but now Keating was exposed. Jaeger's Luger barked, the round tearing through Keating's side. White-hot pain lanced through him, but adrenaline kept him on his feet. He dove forward, rolling across the open space toward Lowell. Bullets chipped concrete around him as the remaining German officer opened fire. Keating reached Lowell, pulling himself behind the minimal cover provided by the fallen soldier's body. Lowell was still alive, though barely. His eyes flickered open as Keating pressed against him. Portfolio, the wounded soldier gasped. I got it. Sure enough, Lowell had managed to pull the leather case beneath him as he fell. With trembling hands, he now pushed it toward Keating. Good man, Keating said, gripping Lowell's shoulder. Just hold on. We'll get you out of here. But Lowell's eyes were already glazing over, his lifeblood pooling beneath him on the cold roof. Another name added to the tally of the dead. Keating secured the portfolio inside his jacket, then checked his wound. The bullet had passed clean through his side, missing vital organs but bleeding freely. A metallic click to his right froze him in place. He turned his head slowly to find himself staring down the barrel of Jaeger's Luger. The German captain stood just feet away, his expression one of grim satisfaction. A valiant effort, Lieutenant, Jaeger said quietly. But it ends here. Keating's sidearm lay just out of reach, knocked from his hand during his desperate dive. He was weaponless, wounded, and at Jaeger's mercy. The portfolio, Jaeger demanded, extending his free hand. Now. Keating's mind raced, calculating options, finding none. Then his hand brushed something at Lowell's belt, the combat knife the soldier always carried. With a motion born of desperation, Keating grabbed the knife and lunged upward. Jaeger fired, but the sudden movement threw off his aim. The bullet grazed Keating's cheek as he drove the knife toward the German's abdomen. Jaeger twisted away at the last moment, the blade slicing across his ribs rather than plunging into his vitals. He staggered back, blood darkening his uniform, but maintained his grip on the Luger. Before he could fire again, Keating tackled him, driving him backward across the roof. The gun discharged harmlessly into the night sky as both men crashed into the parapet. Jaeger was strong, but Keating fought with the desperate fury of a man with nothing left to lose. They grappled at the edge of the roof, each struggling for control of the knife that Keating still clutched. Jaeger slammed his elbow into Keating's wounded side, drawing a gasp of agony from the American. In return, Keating drove his knee upward, catching Jaeger in the solar plexus. The German's grip loosened momentarily, giving Keating the opening he needed. He wrenched the knife free and, with a swift, brutal motion, drove it into Jaeger's side just below the ribs. Jaeger's eyes widened, more in surprise than pain. His Luger clattered to the roof as his hands instinctively went to the wound. Keating stepped back, watching as the German captain slowly sank to his knees, blood flowing freely between his fingers. "So," Jaeger said, his voice remarkably steady despite his injury, "this is how it ends." Keating retrieved his sidearm, aiming it at Jaeger's head. One pull of the trigger would end it, would avenge Monroe and Lowell and all the others who had died under his command. His finger tightened on the trigger. Jaeger met his gaze without flinching. "Do what you must, Lieutenant. But know this. Kill me, and you become me. Completely." The words hit Keating like a physical blow. He hesitated, the rage inside him, warring with something else, some remnant of the schoolteacher he had once been. The sound of boots on the metal staircase broke the moment. Mason burst onto the roof, weapon raised, with several other American soldiers behind him. Miller among them, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but very much alive. "Lieutenant," Mason called, "are you all right?" Keating lowered his weapon, slowly, not taking his eyes off Jaeger. "I'm fine. The documents are secure." He stepped back from the kneeling German. "Bind his wound. He's our prisoner now." Jaeger's expression flickered with surprise. "You spare me, Lieutenant? Why?" Keating holstered his sidearm. "Not for your sake," he replied coldly. "For mine." As Mason and the others secured Jaeger, Keating moved to the edge of the roof. Below, the compound had been secured. American soldiers, reinforcements from their own lines, were moving through the courtyard, setting up defensive positions. The battle was over. They had taken the stronghold against impossible odds. The intelligence that could save thousands of lives was secure in Keating's jacket. Yet as he stood there, watching the sun begin to rise over the blood-soaked forest, Keating felt no triumph, only a bone-deep weariness and the crushing weight of those who had died following his orders. "Sir," Mason said, appearing at his side. "Command's on the radio. They want to speak with you." He paused, studying Keating's expression. "We did it, Lieutenant. We actually did it." Keating nodded slowly, his eyes still on the rising sun. "Yeah, we did." But as he turned to follow Mason back inside, the question that had been gnawing at him since his confrontation with Jaeger remained unanswered. At what cost? And was it worth it? Dawn broke over the German stronghold in shades of crimson and gold. Keating stood at the east-facing window of the command center, watching the first light spill across the forest canopy. Behind him, his remaining men fortified their position. The brief euphoria of their victory had faded, replaced by grim reality. They had taken the stronghold, secured the intelligence, and captured Hauptmann Jaeger. But they were still deep, behind enemy lines, low on ammunition, and exhausted beyond measure. "Radio's working," Mason reported, approaching with a cup of lukewarm coffee. "I made contact with Allied command. They're sending reinforcements, tanks, infantry, the works." "ETA?" Keating asked. 3 hours if they don't run into resistance." Keating took a sip of the bitter liquid. "We're not going to have 3 hours." Mason followed his gaze to the forest edge. Already, movement could be seen among the trees. German scouts, probing their defenses. "How many?" "Company strength." "At least," Keating replied. "Maybe more. And they'll hit us hard. This position is too important for them to give up without a fight." The intelligence they'd recovered had proven even more valuable than they'd initially thought. Not just plans for a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, but detailed, Maps of German supply lines, troop movements, and even the locations of several V-2 rocket launch sites. The kind of intelligence that could save thousands of Allied lives and possibly shorten the war by months. Worth dying for, Keating supposed. But the cold calculation of that thought did nothing to ease the hollow ache in his chest when he thought of Monroe's lifeless eyes or Lowell's blood pooling beneath him on the roof. "We've got 42 men," Mason said, breaking into his thoughts. "Half of them wounded to some degree. 7 MG positions, plus whatever small arms we can scrounge. Maybe 2 hours of ammunition if we're careful. And they'll have hundreds." Keating finished. He turned from the window, his face set in grim determination. "Gather the men, we need to prepare." Over the next hour, they transformed the Stronghold into a fortress. Furniture was pushed against windows and doors. Firing positions were established with interlocking fields of fire. The wounded who could still hold a weapon were posted at windows on the upper floors, while those too injured to fight were moved to the relative safety of the cellar. Doc Walsh worked tirelessly among the wounded, his medical supplies nearly depleted. His once pristine uniform was now stained with so much blood it looked black in places. When Keating found him, the medic was stitching a gash on Miller's forehead with trembling hands. "How are we looking, Doc?" Keating asked, though he could read the answer in Walsh's exhausted face. 6 critical. Won't make it without proper medical attention." Walsh didn't look up from his work, his voice flat and clinical. 12 others who can fight if they have to, but shouldn't. The rest are walking wounded." Keating nodded, processing this information like every other piece of bad news he'd received over the past 3 days. "And you? How are you holding up?" Walsh's hands stilled momentarily. "I've been a medic for 2 years, Lieutenant. I've patched up hundreds of boys, sent them back into the fight. But this..." He shook his head, returning to his stitching. "This is a slaughterhouse, and we both know what's coming." "We're getting reinforcements," Keating said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "We just need to hold out for a few hours." Walsh tied off the last stitch and cut the thread with a small pair of scissors. "You and I both know we won't last that long." Before Keating could respond, Kowalski appeared in the doorway, his injured leg now properly bandaged but still causing him to limp heavily. "Lieutenant," the sharpshooter called, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to see this." Keating followed Kowalski to the western observation post, where a pair of field glasses had been set up on a tripod. Through them he could see a column of German vehicles moving along the forest road. Trucks filled with infantry, a few light tanks, even a couple of mobile artillery pieces. "I count at least 200 men," Kowalski said grimly. "And that's just what we can see from here." Keating nodded, a cold certainty settling in his gut. "They'll attack from multiple sides, try to overwhelm us with numbers." "And they brought Jaeger's personal guard," Kowalski added, pointing to a group of soldiers in distinctive field gray uniforms. "Waffen SS, elite troops. They don't look happy. Their commander is our prisoner." "Where's Jaeger now?" Keating asked, suddenly concerned. The last thing they needed was for the German captain to escape and take command of the attacking force. "Secured in the wine cellar. Miller and 2 others are guarding him." Keating considered this. Jaeger might be a valuable bargaining chip, or a dangerous liability. "Keep him under heavy guard. If the situation deteriorates, we may need to use him as leverage." He turned away from the observation post, his mind already mapping out defensive positions and fallback points. But deep down, he knew the cold truth. They were about to be overwhelmed. The only real question was how many Germans they could take down with them before the end. "Lieutenant," a voice called from below. "Movement in the tree line, west side. They're forming up for an attack." And so it begins, Keating thought. "All units to defensive positions," he ordered, his voice carrying across the Stronghold. "Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count." The men moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had faced death too many times to fear it anymore. Kowalski took up position at the highest window, his sniper rifle propped on a makeshift rest. Mason organized a mobile reserve on the ground floor, ready to reinforce any position that showed signs of breaking. Walsh continued his rounds among the wounded, now with a rifle slung across his back, an addition that did not go unnoticed by Keating. The first German assault came exactly as Keating had predicted. A frontal attack from the west aimed at the main entrance. A wave of infantry rushed from the tree line, using the morning mist for cover. But Kowalski was ready. His rifle cracked, once, twice, 3 times, and each shot found its mark. German soldiers fell, but more kept coming. "Hold fire until they're in the clearing," Keating ordered through the field radio they'd scavenged. "Make them pay for every inch." When the Germans reached the open ground between the forest and the stronghold, the Americans opened fire from all positions. Machine guns chattered from fortified windows, rifles cracked from the roof. The first wave of attackers was cut down before they reached the halfway point. But the Germans were nothing if not persistent. The second wave came with more cover, smoke grenades obscuring their advance, light mortars pounding the American positions. They reached the outer wall of the compound before being driven back, leaving their dead and wounded scattered across the blood-soaked ground. For nearly an hour the pattern continued. German attacks, American defense, a brief lull, then another, assault. Each time the Germans got a little closer. Each time the Americans expended a little more of their precious ammunition. "East side," someone shouted over the radio. "They're breaching the east entrance." Keating raced through the corridors of the stronghold, Mason and 2 others at his heels. They reached the east wing just as a thunderous explosion blew the reinforced Dacker off its hinges. Through the smoke and debris, German soldiers poured into the building. "Fall back to checkpoint Bravo," Keating ordered, directing his men to a prearranged defensive position at the end of the corridor. Controlled retreat. They backed away, firing as they went. One of Keating's men took a round to the shoulder and went down. Mason dragged him behind cover while Keating provided suppressing fire. They managed to reach the checkpoint, a hastily constructed barricade of overturned furniture and filing cabinets, and took up defensive positions. The Germans advanced cautiously down the corridor, clearly wary of a trap. They had good reason to be. Lowell had rigged several improvised explosive devices in key locations before his death. As the first German soldier passed a seemingly innocuous supply closet, Keating pressed the detonator. The explosion ripped through the narrow space, the concussion amplified by the confined walls. Screams echoed as the leading Germans were torn apart by the blast and the following shrapnel of nails and metal scraps. "That'll slow them down," Mason said grimly, ejecting an empty magazine from his rifle and slapping in his last full one. "But I'm almost out." Keating checked his own ammunition. 3 rounds left in his pistol, half a magazine in his carbine. "Make them count, we just need to hold out a little longer." But even as he said it, he heard the sounds of fighting intensify throughout the building. The western defenses were being pushed back room by room. The roof was under heavy fire from German mortars, and now the east entrance had been breached. The next hour passed in a blur of desperate fighting. Keating moved from position to position, shoring up defenses where they weakened, directing fire where it was most needed. He lost track of how many times he discharged his weapon, how many orders he barked, how many wounded men he helped drag to safer ground. At some point he found himself back at the command center, which had been transformed into a hasty field hospital. Walsh was working frantically over a soldier with a chest wound, his hands slick with blood. "How are we doing, Doc?" Keating asked, already knowing the answer. Walsh didn't look up from his patient. "We've lost 12 more. Another 16 won't make it without immediate evacuation." He pressed a bandage against the wounded man's chest, trying to stem the bleeding. "The rest are still fighting, somehow." A tremendous explosion rocked the building, sending dust and plaster raining down from the ceiling. The sound of gunfire intensified from the floor below. "They've breached the main hall," Mason reported, appearing in the doorway with a fresh cut across his forehead. "We're falling back to the last defensive line." Keating nodded, his mind racing through options that dwindled with each passing minute. "What about Kowalski? Is he still at his post?" "Out of ammunition 10 minutes ago," Mason replied grimly. "Last I saw, he was defending the south corridor with nothing but a bayonet and pure stubbornness." Something cold and heavy settled in Keating's chest. Kowalski had been with him from the beginning, one of the few who had survived the initial ambush that had stranded them behind enemy lines. The thought of the sharpshooter reduced to fighting with a blade against overwhelming odds. We need to fall back to the cellar, Keating decided. One final defensive position. We can hold out there until reinforcements arrive. And if they don't arrive in time? Walsh asked, looking up from his patient for the first time. The medic's eyes were hollow, haunted by all he had seen. Then we make our last stand there, Keating replied simply. They began the process of evacuating the wounded to the cellar, a stone-walled space beneath the stronghold that had once stored wine and supplies. It was defensible, with only one narrow entrance and thick walls that could withstand most small arms fire. But it was also a potential tomb if the Germans decided to simply seal them in and wait for starvation or surrender. Keating helped carry a wounded man down the narrow stairs to the cellar, his muscles screaming in protest after days of continuous exertion. As he turned to head back up for another, Walsh caught his arm. "Lieutenant," the medic said, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle above. "I need to tell you something." Keating paused, noting the strange look in Walsh's eyes. "What is it, Doc?" "I killed a man today," Walsh said, the words tumbling out as if he needed to purge them. "Not as a medic, not to save someone else. I picked up a rifle and I shot a German soldier who was coming through that door." He pointed to the cellar entrance with a trembling hand. "I watched him die, and God help me. I felt relieved." Keating placed a hand on the medic's shoulder, feeling the tremors that ran through the other man's body. "We do what we have to do to survive, Doc. To protect each other." "I took an oath," Walsh whispered. "First, do no harm. What kind of medic am I now?" "The kind who's kept more men alive in the past 3 days than most doctors do in a month of practice," Keating replied firmly. "The kind who's going to keep fighting because that's what we do. We fight until we can't anymore." A tremendous crash from above cut off any further conversation. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the sound of boots on stone grew louder. Germans moving through the floor above, searching for survivors. "They're inside," Mason reported from the top of the cellar stairs. "South wing has fallen. West wing is overrun. North wing is still holding, but barely." Keating nodded, a strange calm settling over him. They had done everything they could. They had fought against impossible odds, secured the intelligence, held out longer than anyone could have reasonably expected. If this was the end, at least, they would meet it on their feet, weapons in hand. "Barricade the entrance," he ordered. "Anyone who can still hold a weapon form a firing line. The rest of you get to the back of the cellar." As the men scrambled to comply, Keating took a moment to check his own wounds. The bullet graze on his arm had reopened, seeping blood through the hasty bandage. The knife wound in his side from his confrontation with Jaeger was a constant throbbing reminder of how close he had come to death on that rooftop. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond pain. There was only the mission now. Hold out. Protect the intelligence. Keep as many of his men alive as possible. From somewhere on the floor above came the sound of a tremendous explosion, followed by the distinctive chatter of American .30 caliber machine guns. Then another sound, one that brought Keating to his feet despite his fatigue, the rumble of tank treads on the gravel outside. "Sir," Miller called from the top of the cellar stairs. "Sir, you need to hear this." Keating climbed the stairs, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. At the top, Miller handed him a field radio, its speaker crackling with static. "Repeat, this is Able Company, 16th Infantry. We have reached the Stronghold and are engaging enemy forces. Any American personnel respond with your location and situation. Over." For a moment, Keating couldn't speak. After everything they had endured, after preparing for a final stand that seemed inevitable, reinforcements had actually arrived. The promised tanks and infantry had made it through, against all odds. "This is Lieutenant Keating, commanding officer of Baker Company, 26th Infantry," he responded, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "We are secure in the cellar level of the main building, approximately 30 personnel, most wounded. We have secured high-value intelligence and one high-ranking prisoner. Request immediate support. Over. Copy that, Lieutenant. Hold your position. We're clearing the building from the top down. ETA to your position 5 minutes. Over. Keating handed the radio back to Miller, hardly daring to believe what he had just heard. Spread the word. Help is here. The change in the men was immediate and profound. Wounded soldiers who had been resigned to death now clung desperately to life, knowing that medical attention was minutes away. Those who could still fight straightened their shoulders, checked their weapons, prepared to join the counterattack if needed. Heavy footsteps approached the cellar door. Keating raised his pistol, still not quite believing that salvation had come. The door burst open, and there stood an American captain flanked by a squad of fresh-faced infantrymen whose uniforms were not yet stained by the blood and mud of the Hürtgenwald. "Lieutenant Keating?" the captain asked, his eyes widening, as he took in the scene before him. The wounded men sprawled across the cellar floor, the haggard defenders with their blood-encrusted uniforms and thousand-yard stares. "That's me," Keating replied, lowering his weapon. "What took you so long?" The afternoon sun slanted through the shattered windows of the Stronghold, casting long shadows across the debris-strewn floor. Lieutenant Keating stood in the command center, staring at the casualty report in his hand. 37 men had followed him into the Hürtgenwald 4 days ago. Only 16 had survived, and 6 of those were critically wounded, 21 dead. 21 letters he would have to write to families explaining why their loved ones weren't coming home. "Lieutenant?" A fresh-faced aide from regimental headquarters stood in the doorway. "Colonel Adams would like to see you, sir. He's in the courtyard." Keating nodded, folding the casualty report and tucking it into his breast pocket. He made his way through corridors now crowded with soldiers who hadn't been part of the battle. Intelligence officers sifting through captured documents, Signal Corps men setting up a radio station, MPs guarding doors that no longer needed guarding. In the courtyard, the contrast was even more pronounced. Clean, rested troops moved with purpose and energy. Medical trucks were being loaded with the wounded, including Peterson, who had somehow survived despite Walsh's grim prognosis. The medic himself was assisting the doctors, his expertise with these specific wounds invaluable. Colonel Adams stood near the main gate, deep in conversation with several officers. When he spotted Keating approaching, he broke away from the group. "Lieutenant Keating," he said, offering his hand. "Damn fine work you did here. Those documents you recovered, they're already on their way to Chaff headquarters. General Eisenhower himself will be briefed." Keating shook the colonel's hand mechanically, feeling strangely detached from the praise. "Thank you, sir. My men deserve the credit." Adams nodded, though Keating had the distinct impression the colonel wasn't really listening. Yes, of course. Outstanding effort by everyone involved." He gestured to a cluster of vehicles parked near the gate. "We're evacuating the last of the wounded now. The intelligence boys will be here for a few more hours, then we're pulling out completely. Can't hold this position long term. Too deep, behind enemy lines." The casual dismissal of the Stronghold, a piece of ground that had cost so many lives, struck Keating like a physical blow. But he kept his face impassive, years of military discipline overriding his instinctive response. "What about the prisoner, Sir Hauptmann Jäger?" "Ah yes, the German captain." Adams consulted a clipboard handed to him by an aide. "According to the medics, he likely won't survive transport. Internal bleeding from the knife wound. They've made him comfortable, but..." The colonel shrugged. The fate of a single enemy, officer clearly not high on his list of concerns. "He's in the West Wing if you want to see him. Room 14, I believe." Keating saluted crisply, more out of habit than respect, and turned to leave. "Oh, Lieutenant," Adams called after him, "you'll be returning with us to headquarters. General wants to debrief you personally about the operation. Could be a commendation. In it for you." He smiled as if offering a great reward. Maybe even a promotion. A commendation. A promotion. As if those things could possibly matter now. "Yes, sir," Keating replied, his voice neutral. "I'll be ready to leave when ordered." He walked away before Adams could say anything more, heading toward the West Wing where Jäger was being held. Along the way, he passed Mason, who was supervising the loading of their few remaining supplies onto a truck. "They're sending us back to HQ," Keating told him quietly, debriefing with the brass. Mason nodded, a cynical smile touching his lips. "Figures. They'll want to pump us for every detail, then stick our faces on recruitment posters. Join the army. Fight like these brave boys." The sergeant spat on the ground, as if anyone could understand what happened here without living. Through it, Adams mentioned commendations, possibly promotions. "Medals," Mason said with quiet contempt. "What are we supposed to do with those? Hang them on Monroe's grave? Pin them to Lowell's chest? To Kowalski's?" At the mention of Kowalski, Keating felt a fresh wave of grief wash over him. The sharpshooter's body had been found in the south corridor, surrounded by 7 dead Germans. He had indeed fought to the last with nothing but his bayonet and his bare hands, buying precious time for the others to fall back to the cellar, a hero's death, the kind that would be immortalized in official reports and newspaper articles back home. But those reports wouldn't mention Kowalski's dry wit, or the way he could spot a deer at 500 yards, or how he always saved a piece of chocolate from his rations for the French children they encountered in liberated villages. The reports would turn him into a symbol, a statistic, a story to be told around dinner tables. They would erase the man and leave only the myth. "I'm going to see Jaeger," Keating said. "Adams says he's dying." Mason's expression hardened. "Good. After what his men did to Kowalski." He trailed off, then sighed, the anger draining from his face, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. "Though I suppose it doesn't really matter anymore, does it? Dead is dead, whether it's him or us." Keating had no answer for that. He simply clasped Mason's shoulder briefly, then continued on his way to the West Wing. Room 14 was small, likely once a servant's quarters when the Stronghold had been a hunting lodge. A young medic sat outside reading a paperback novel. He looked up as Keating approached. "Lieutenant Keating? They said you might come by." He stood, tucking the book into his pocket. "He's conscious, but fading fast. Internal bleeding from that knife wound. We've given him morphine for the pain, but that's about all we can do." Keating nodded his thanks. "I'd like to see him alone, if that's all right." The medic hesitated. "He's a prisoner of war, sir. Regulations state—" "I'm well aware of the regulations," Keating interrupted, his voice taking on the hard edge of command that had developed over the past 4 days. "But I'm also the officer who captured him, and I'm telling you I want 5 minutes alone with him." Whether it was the tone of authority or the hollow look in Keating's eyes, the medic relented. "Yes, sir. 5 minutes." He stepped aside, allowing Keating to enter the room. Jaeger lay on a narrow cot, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. His uniform jacket had been removed, replaced by bandages that were already seeping crimson. Despite his condition, the German captain's eyes were alert, and they followed Keating as he entered the room. "Lieutenant Keating," Jaeger said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his pallor. "I wondered if you would come." Keating pulled up a wooden chair and sat beside the cot. For a long moment he simply studied the man who had been his adversary, the hunter who had tracked them through the forest with such relentless precision. "The medic says you're dying," Keating said finally, blunt and direct. There seemed little point in pleasantries now. A ghost of a smile touched Jaeger's lips. Always so forthright. "Yes, I am dying. Your knife found its mark after all, just delayed in its effect." He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. "Your medics have been kind. More than I would have expected. They're professionals. They don't see uniforms, just wounds. Unlike us," Jaeger observed. "We see only uniforms, only flags and symbols. It makes it easier to kill, doesn't it? To reduce men to abstractions." Keating didn't respond. He wasn't here for philosophical discussions about the nature of war. "Why did you spare me on the roof?" Jaeger asked, seeming to read his thoughts. "You could have ended it there. Should have, perhaps." It was a question Keating had asked himself many times since that moment on the rooftop. The truth was he wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "You said if I killed you I would become you," he replied slowly. Maybe I wanted to prove you wrong. Or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that there was still something left of the man I was before all this. Jaeger nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. And is there? Something left of that man? Keating considered the question. Was there anything left of the schoolteacher who had believed in reason and order? The man who had taught young boys about history and literature, who had coached the baseball team on weekends, that man seemed as distant and unreal as a character in a novel he'd once read. I don't know, he admitted finally. I hope so. For what it's worth, Jaeger said, his voice growing weaker, I believe there is. A true monster would not doubt, himself as you do. They fell silent, each lost in his own thoughts. Outside the window, clouds scudded across the sky, casting shifting shadows on the floor between them. Was it worth it? Jaeger asked suddenly. All of this? He gestured feebly at the room around them, but Keating understood he meant much more. The battle, the deaths, the entire blood-soaked insanity of war. I don't know that either, Keating replied honestly. We got the intelligence. Supposedly it will save thousands of lives. Shorten the war, maybe. He shook his head. But when I think of Monroe dying in my arms, asking if he'd done good, I can't weigh that against abstract numbers. The arithmetic of war, Jaeger murmured, always calculated in blood. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and a thin trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Lieutenant Daniel. May I call you Daniel now that we are no longer enemies? Keating felt a strange tightness in his chest at the use of his first name. Something so simple, yet so humanizing. Yes. Daniel, then. I want you to know something. Jaeger's voice had grown fainter, forcing Keating to lean closer to hear him. In another life, I too was a teacher. Mathematics, at a gymnasium in Dresden. I had students, colleagues, a fiancée. His eyes took on a distant look. She was killed in an Allied bombing raid last year. The irony does not escape me. Keating didn't know what to say. The revelation that Jaeger had been a teacher just like him, that he too had lost someone he loved to this war, it stripped away the last vestiges of the enemy as an abstraction. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words wholly inadequate, but all he had to offer. Jaeger's gaze refocused on him. As am I for your men. For what it's worth, they fought with extraordinary courage. Especially the sharpshooter. Kowalski, was it? 7 of my best men with nothing but a bayonet. A trace of professional admiration colored his voice. A warrior worthy of remembrance. They all were, Keating said quietly. Yes, all of them. Jaeger's breathing had become more labored, his words coming in short gasps. Daniel, when you leave here, do not let them make you into something you are not. A hero, a symbol. Do not let them use your pain to create more pain. I won't, Keating promised, though he wasn't sure how he would keep that promise. Jaeger nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. His eyes closed, his breathing growing shallower. I am very tired now. Keating sat with him in silence, watching, as the German captain's breaths came further and further apart. There was no dramatic last gasp, no final words of wisdom or regret. Just the quiet slipping away of life, one breath at a time, until Hauptmann Erich Jaeger was gone. Keating stood. He straightened Jaeger's blanket, closed the German's eyes with a gentle pass of his hand, and left the room without looking back. Outside, the evacuation was nearly complete. He found Walsh helping to load medical supplies into a truck. The medic looked up as Keating approached, his expression unreadable. Jaeger's dead, Keating told him. Walsh nodded, unsurprised. Figured he wouldn't last long with that wound. Internal bleeding's a bastard without proper surgical facilities. You did everything you could. Did I? Walsh asked, a bitter edge to his voice. Or did I just go through the motions? Professional obligation, they call it. Care for the wounded regardless of uniform. He sighed. Hard to maintain that professional distance when you've seen what their side did to Monroe, to Kowalski, to all the others. What are you going to do now? Keating asked. After the debriefing, I mean. Walsh shrugged. Keep patching up boys so they can go back out and get shot at again, I suppose. What else is there? He glanced at Keating. What about you? Adams mentioned a promotion. He did, Keating confirmed. But I don't think I'm going to take it. Walsh studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. You know, before the war I was halfway through medical school. Had dreams of opening a practice in my hometown. Funny how distant that life seems now. Like it happened to someone else. Do you think you'll go back to it? After? After, Walsh repeated, as if the word itself was foreign. I don't know. Can't imagine sitting in a lecture hall again writing notes about proper surgical techniques while pretending I haven't held a man's intestines in my hands, trying to stuff them back inside him while he screams for his mother. He shook his head. But what's the alternative? Carry this darkness forever? It was a question Keating had been asking himself ever since Monroe had died in his arms. What came after? How did one return to normal life after experiencing the utter abnormality of war? He had no answer for Walsh because he had no answer for himself. I don't know, he said finally. But whatever comes next, we survived. That has to count for something. Walsh didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. I suppose it does. He glanced over Keating's shoulder. Your ride's here. Colonel Adams is waving you over. Sure enough, Adams was standing by a staff car, gesturing impatiently for Keating to join him. The debriefing at headquarters, the commendation, the promotion, the first steps in what would no doubt be a carefully orchestrated narrative about heroism and sacrifice, with Keating cast as the central figure, the schoolteacher-turned-warrior, who had led his men on a daring mission behind enemy lines, a story that would mention nothing of Monroe's terror, or Lowell's quiet courage, or Kowalski's final stand. In that moment, Keating knew he couldn't do it. Couldn't sit across from generals who had never set foot in the Hürtgenwald and explain to them what it had been like. Couldn't accept medals for surviving when so many of his men hadn't. Tell Adams I'll be right there, he said to Walsh. I need to get something from inside first. Walsh seemed to sense that something had changed, but he simply nodded. Good luck, Lieutenant. You too, Doc. Keating walked back into the Stronghold. But instead of gathering his possessions, he made his way to the eastern exit, the one furthest from the waiting staff cars and impatient officers. No one stopped him. In the organized chaos of the evacuation, one more soldier moving with purpose didn't attract attention. Outside, the forest stretched away to the horizon, the late afternoon sun filtering through the branches. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the Allied lines, and beyond that, home, or what passed for home now. For a moment, Keating hesitated. What he was contemplating was desertion, punishable by court-martial. But he knew, with a certainty that transcended fear or doubt, that he could not go back to being just another piece on the military chessboard, could not resume his place in a system that had sent him and his men into the Hürtgenwald to die. He had fulfilled his duty. He had completed his mission. He had brought the intelligence back at a cost that no one who hadn't been there could possibly understand. Now, he would choose his own path forward. With a deep breath, he stepped into the forest, leaving behind the Stronghold, the staff cars, the waiting colonel. With each step, he felt the weight of rank and obligation falling away, replaced by a different burden, the memories of those who had died under his command, the faces that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the Stronghold disappeared behind him, Keating walked on into the gathering dusk, the weight of his fallen men heavier than any medal command could ever give him. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.